Today is 12 years since the passing of my dad. My dad is now in the Abha kingdom. He's up there watching down on us, wondering why my hair is the way it is probably, and smiling hopefully and encouraging all of us to go on this journey.
O my God, O thou forgiver of sins, bestower of gifts, dispeller of afflictions, verily I beseech thee to forgive the sins of such as have abandoned the physical garment and have ascended to the spiritual world. O my Lord, purify them from trespasses, dispel their sorrows, and change their darkness into light. Cause them to enter the garden of happiness, cleanse them with the most pure water, and grant them to behold thy splendors on the loftiest mount. Abdul Baha.
Thank you very much. Thank you, people. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of God Passes By, the book that goes through the first 100 years of the Baha'i era, as our guardian Shoghi Effendi terms it. I'm going to do a quick recap as to what we studied last time, and then we're going to soldier on and go deeper into this incredible story. We are currently in the second period. The first period, of course, deals with His Holiness the Bab. The second period deals with His Holiness Baha'u'llah. Last time we had learned that Baha'u'llah was the fulfillment of the great announcement. We looked at a lot of prophecies that were around from various scripts, from the Revelation of St. John, from the Quran, from all different sources as the fulfillment of who Baha'u'llah was. Sheikh Ahmad had given a clue about him whose cause shall be made known, and he talks and says it will be after him. Him means after a while literally, but has the abjad value of 68, which refers to the year 1268, which then coincides with 1853, that in 1853 something will happen. Of course, we know this is where His Holiness Baha'u'llah gets his revelation in the Siyar. We also look at some writings from Sayyid Kazim Arashti, the successor of Sheikh Ahmad, and he talks about 18 years will elapse. And of course, the earth will go on with 18 years with just the Bab's revelation, the faith of the Bab, and then Baha'u'llah will come in and will change everything. Add to a lot of what the Bab said, but bring about these phenomenal reverberating vibrations across the world. He then talks about after the Ga'em will come the Gayyum. Ga'em meaning the one who will rise, Gayyum meaning the self-subsisting. The Ga'em refers to the Bab, Gayyum to Baha'u'llah. When we look at the abjad system of the word Ga'em, we know that Ga'em equals 147. Gayyum is 156. So even there we have a little clue that there's a gap of 9 between them, which refers to the 9 years that will pass before Baha'u'llah will have his revelation. It's said that one goodly deed is worth more than all the pious deeds of bygone ages. This is in the Bayan. The Bab writes, beware lest the Bayan become a veil to accepting him whom God shall make manifest. The Bab says he was the first one to believe in him who shall make manifest. So again, turning our attention to Baha'u'llah. The Bayan also talks about the son of Ali, so there's an allusion made to who Baha'u'llah will be. Of course, we know that Imam Ali, this is referring to, he had 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein. Baha'u'llah's name was Mirza Hussein Ali, so the son of Ali, being Hussein, is again a reference to Baha'u'llah. There's another passage where it talks about the year-old gem will have potent superiority to the whole of the Bayan, so that this baby that will be a year essentially will able to expound more and have much more potency than the whole of the Bayan. Again, he's exalting the station of Baha'u'llah and indeed his writings. He then talks about being the ring on the finger of Baha'u'llah. He says, all my writings, the Bayan, are a ring upon my finger, and I am a ring upon the finger of him whom God shall make manifest. Again, given this station exalted so much. Today, the Bayan is in the state of a seed. He says when Baha'u'llah comes, he will make it the ultimate perfection, will become manifest of this Bayan. Again, and he says, that's the year 9, and he talks about the year 9, so 9 years passing again. This is the day that will not be followed by night, of course, referring to Abdul Baha and then the Universal House of Justice, that we're constantly given this guidance through these teachings. Abdul Baha talks about the past saints being overwhelmed. When Baha'u'llah comes, he will abrogate the dispensations of the past. A lot of the laws will change and things will be refreshed. In the Surat al-Haykal, Baha'u'llah talks about the Maiden of Honor pointing to him and saying, you are the one, and how the whole world will rise and be joyous. He writes an epistle, the epistle to the son of the book, And he says in that, I did not choose to be these things. These are not the things that I went after. These were things that were conferred upon me. While he's there, he talks about these four entities, which essentially are one, I suppose, but he talks about the angel Gabriel, the Spirit of glory, the Holy Spirit, and the most great Spirit, how they all said to him, arise from your slumber and start. Finally, we know that in Adrianople, this is when Baha'u'llah will reach his zenith, as it were. So it's all exciting. We know that terrible things have happened. The Holocaust is taking place. The Babylon's on downfall. Now Baha'u'llah is coming, and things are going to change. The fortune is going to change through more hard work.
Dave, so you're saying four entities announced to Baha'u'llah, he was Baha'u'llah? Four entities?
That's what Baha'u'llah says, yes. But again, I think it's metaphorical. He doesn't just say the Holy Spirit bade him or Gabriel bade him. He said that these four entities that bade him and said, arise. So maybe it's to signify the potency that he has or the big jump that's going on. But yeah, that's what's said, Lloyd.
Thank you.
Baha'u'llah's banishment to Iraq. The attempt on the life of Nasir ad-Din Shah, as stated in a previous chapter, was made on the 28th of the month of Shawwal, 1268 AH, corresponding to 15 August 1852. Immediately after Baha'u'llah was arrested in Neo-Iran, was conducted with the greatest ignominy to Tehran and cast into the Siachal. His imprisonment lasted for a period of no less than 4 months, in the middle of which the year 1269, anticipated in such glowing terms by the Bab and alluded to as the year after Hind by Sheikh Ahmad Asai, was ushered in, endowing with undreamt of potentialities the whole world. 2 months after that year was born Baha'u'llah, the purpose of his imprisonment now accomplished, was released from his confinement and set out a month later for Baghdad on the first stage of a memorable and lifelong exile, which was to carry him in the course of years as far as Adrianople in European Turkey, and which was to end with his 24 years incarceration in Akka. Now that he had been invested in consequence of that potent dream with the power and sovereign authority associated with his divine mission, his deliverance from a confinement that had achieved its purpose, and which, if prolonged, would have completely fettered him in the exercise of his newly bestowed functions, became not only inevitable, but imperative and urgent. Nor were the means and instruments lacking whereby his emancipation from the shackles that restrained him could be effected. The persistent and decisive intervention of the Russian minister, Prince Dolgoruki, who left no stone unturned to establish the innocence of Baha'u'llah, the public confession of Mullah Sheikh Ali Torshizi, surnamed Azim, who in the Siachal, in the presence of the Hajib al-Dawleh and the Russian minister's interpreter, and of the government's representative, emphatically exonerated him and acknowledged his own complicity. The indisputable testimony established by competent tribunals, the unrelaxing efforts exerted by his own brothers, sisters, and kindred, all these combined to effect his ultimate deliverance from the hands of his rapacious enemies. Another potent, if less evident influence, which must be acknowledged as having had a share in his liberation, was the fate suffered by so large a number of his self-sacrificing fellow disciples who languished with him in that same prison. For as Nabil truly remarks, the bloodshed in the course of that fateful year in Tehran by that heroic band with whom Baha'u'llah had been imprisoned was the ransom paid for his deliverance from the hand of a foe that sought to prevent him from achieving the purpose for which God had destined him. With such overwhelming testimonies establishing beyond the shadow of a doubt the non-complicity of Baha'u'llah, the Grand Vizier, after having secured the reluctant consent of his sovereign to set free his captive, was now in a position to dispatch his trusted representative, Haji Ali, to the Siachal, instructing him to deliver to Baha'u'llah the order for his release. The sight which that emissary beheld upon his arrival evoked in him such anger that he cursed his master for the shameful treatment of a man of such high position and stainless renown. Removing his mantle from his shoulder, he presented it to Baha'u'llah, entreating him to wear it when in the presence of the minister and his counselors, a request which he emphatically refused, preferring to appear attired in the garb of a prisoner before the members of the imperial government. No sooner had he presented himself before them than the Grand Vizier addressed him, saying, "Had you chosen to take my advice, and had you dissociated yourself from the faith of the Sayyid Bab, you would have never suffered the pains and indignities that have been heaped upon you. Had you, in your turn," Baha'u'llah retorted, "followed my counsels, the affairs of the government would not have been reached so critical a stage." Mirza Agha Khan was thereupon reminded of the conversation he had had with him on the occasion of the Bab's martyrdom, when he had been warned that the flame that has been kindled will blaze forth more fiercely than ever. "What is it that you advise me now to do?" he inquired from Baha'u'llah. "Command the governors of the realm," was the instant reply, "to cease shedding the blood of the innocent, to cease plundering their property, to cease dishonoring their women and injuring their children." That same day, the Grand Vizier acted on the advice thus given him. But any effect it had, as the course of subsequent events amply demonstrated, proved to be momentary and negligible. The relative peace and tranquility accorded Baha'u'llah after his tragic and cruel imprisonment was destined by the dictates of an unerring wisdom to be of an extremely short duration. He had hardly rejoined his family and kindred when a decree from Nasir-ad-Din Shah was communicated to him, bidding him leave the territory of Persia, fixing a time limit of 1 month for his departure and allowing him the right to choose the land of his exile.
The attempt on the life of the Shah took place on the 15th of August, 1852. This is what preceded the big Holocaust. We know Baha'u'llah went from Niyabaran to Tehran. Remember, he was marched by foot. It was maybe 5 or 6 hours in the hot sun. His clothes were taken off. He had horrible blisters, horrendous conditions as he got there. He then goes into the Siachal, into the black pit, where he's thrown into this prison, where there are 3 sets of stairs that you have to go down. It was horrible. It was damp, disgusting conditions. He was there with 150 other thieves and highwaymen, and of course some other Ba'is. So they've thrown them into prison now after this attempt on the life of the Shah. After his release, we know that a month later he's then sent off to Baghdad over here, and then he's going to be heading out to Turkey, where he will initially go to Istanbul, and then he will go on to Edirne. Istanbul, we can see, is here, Edirne is here. That's what's going to happen. Baha'u'llah's release partly was affected because of the work of Prince Dolgoruki. Dolgoruki was this Russian diplomat who was in Iran, and his daughter had met Baha'u'llah and was very much blown away, and he was the foreign minister for Russia in Iran at the time. he then does all he can, and he even says to Baha'u'llah, look, you can come and you can be safe. You can just come and stay in Russia. Whereas Baha'u'llah decided that he was going to go on to Baghdad and to other pastures. A representative of Prime Minister Mirza Aga Khan was sent down to see the conditions, and he's absolutely disgusted by what he sees. He says, this is disgusting. How could you let this prisoner be in these conditions? And he writes to the Prime Minister and has a right go at him. He also takes off his mantle, like his cloak, and he gives it to Baha'u'llah and says, look, wear this. You look in terrible condition. Baha'u'llah says, no, I want to meet the Prime Minister dressed as a prisoner because that's what I am. Nabil talks about a lot of the death that was suffered by the Babis, that this was almost like a ransom paid for Baha'u'llah's release. Remember, once the attempt happens on the life of the Shah's mum is absolutely furious and actually is blaming Baha'u'llah, thinking that Baha'u'llah's the one behind it, and wants him to be murdered, essentially. But we know that Sayyid Ali Tarshizi, surnamed Azim, he's the one who turned around and said, look, I am the one who committed this crime. And in front of the Hajj Budawla, he turned around and said, look, it was me, it was nothing to do with Baha'u'llah. So these combined facts ends up with Baha'u'llah's release. This takes place around the year Hind, 68 as well, so 1853, and that's where Baha'u'llah has his revelations. When Baha'u'llah meets the Vizier, when he meets the Prime Minister says to him, look, I told you, if you hadn't got mixed up with the Bab and all this Babi movement, you would have been fine. You wouldn't have had any of these problems. Baha'u'llah very quickly says back to him, he says, if you would have actually not messed with this, the affairs of the government would not be so bad. Everything, all the decline has happened because of this. And he says, did I not tell you this when the Bab was martyred? The Grand Vizier thinks and says, okay, well, what should I do? Baha'u'llah says, stop abusing the downtrodden, stop plundering their property, stop all of this. The Prime Minister listened, but it didn't really last. He's going to be heading off to the land of Turkey. This was all under the Ottoman rule. This was under the Ottoman Empire, so this was the province of Iraq. Also in Iraq, all apart from 4 of the Imams are actually buried in Iraq. We have Imam Ali, who's in Najaf, we have Imam Hussein, who's in Karbala. In Kazimain, we have the 7th and the 9th Imams who are there. So there's a lot of Imams that are buried in this area. Of course, Iran being predominantly Shia and Iraq being predominantly Sunni. The Ottoman Empire was ruled by the Caliphate for many years, ever since Constantinople was seized after the Byzantine Empire came crushing down. We have these various caliphs that were in power, and they were the sultans, and the sultan was the head of the state, but it was also the caliph, so he had great reach over the Islamic world as well. But that's something we'll maybe touch on a little bit later.
The Russian minister, as soon as he was informed of the imperial decision, expressed the desire to take Baha'u'llah under the protection of his government and offered to extend every facility for his removal to Russia. This invitation, so spontaneously extended, Baha'u'llah declined, preferring, in pursuance of an unerring instinct, to establish his abode in Turkish territory in the city of Baghdad. Whilst I lay chained and fettered in the prison, he himself, years after, testified in his epistle addressed to the Tsar of Russia, Nikolaevich Alexander II, one of thy ministers extended me his aid, whereupon God hath ordained for thee a station which the knowledge of none can comprehend except his knowledge. Beware lest thou barter away this sublime station. In the days is yet another illuminating testimony revealed by his pen. When this wrong one was sore afflicted in prison, the minister of the highly esteemed government of Russia, may God glorified and exalted be he, assist him, exerted his utmost endeavor to compass my deliverance. Several times permission for my release was granted. Some of the ulama of the city, however, would prevent it. Finally, my freedom was gained through the solicitude and the endeavor of His Excellency, the Minister. His Imperial Majesty, the Most Great Emperor, may God exalted and glorified be he, assist him, extended to me for the sake of God, his protection, a protection which has excited the envy and enmity of the foolish ones of the earth. The Shah's edict, equivalent to an order for the immediate expulsion of Baha'u'llah from Persian territory, opens a new and glorious chapter in the history of the first Baha'i century. Viewed in its proper perspective, it will be even recognized to have ushered in one of the most eventful and momentous epochs in the world's religious history. It coincides with the inauguration of a ministry extending over a period of almost 40 years, a ministry which, by virtue of its creative power, its cleansing force, its healing influences, and the irresistible operation of the world-directing, world-shaping forces it released, stands unparalleled in the religious annals of the entire human race. It marks the opening phase in a series of banishments, ranging from a period of 4 decades and terminating only with the death of him who was the object of that cruel edict. The process which it set in motion, gradually progressing and unfolding, began by establishing his cause for a time in the very midst of the jealously guarded stronghold of Shia Islam, and brought him in personal contact with its highest and most illustrious exponents. Then, at a later stage, it confronted him at the seat of the caliphate with the civil and ecclesiastical dignitaries of the realm and the representatives of the Sultan of Turkey, the most powerful potentate in the Islamic world, and finally carried him as far as the shores of the Holy Land, thereby fulfilling the prophecies recorded in both the Old and the New Testaments, redeeming the pledge enshrined in various traditions attributed to the Apostle of God and the Imams who succeeded him, and ushering in the long-awaited restoration of Israel to the ancient cradle of its faith. With it may be said to have begun the last and most fruitful of the 4 stages of a life, the first 27 years of which were characterized by the carefree enjoyment of all the advantages conferred by high birth and riches, and by an unfailing solicitude for the interests of the poor, the sick, and the downtrodden, followed by 9 years of active and exemplary discipleship in the service of the Bab, and finally by an imprisonment of 4 months' duration, overshadowed throughout by mortal peril, embittered by agonizing sorrows, and immortalized as it drew to a close by the sudden eruption of the forces released by an overpowering, soul-revolutionizing revelation. This enforced and hurried departure of Baha'u'llah from his native land, accompanied by some of his relatives, recalls in some of its aspects the precipitate flight of the Holy Family into Egypt, the sudden migration of Muhammad soon after his assumption of the prophetic office from Mecca to Medina, the exodus of Moses, his brother, and his followers from the land of their birth in response to the divine summons, and above all, the banishment of Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees to the Promised Land, a banishment which, in the multitudinous benefits it conferred upon so many diverse peoples, faiths, and nations, constitutes the nearest historical approach to the incalculable blessings destined to be vouchsafed in this day and in future ages to the whole human race, in direct consequence of the exile suffered by him whose cause is the flower and fruit of all previous revelations. Abdu'l-Baha, after enumerating in some answered questions the far-reaching consequences of Abraham's banishment, significantly affirms that since the exile of Abraham from Ur to Aleppo in Syria produced this result, we must consider what will be the effect of the exile of Baha'u'llah in his several removes from Tehran to Baghdad, from thence to Constantinople, to Rumelia, and to the Holy Land. On the first day of the month of Rabi' Asani of the year 1269, January 12, 1853, 9 months after his return from Karbala, Baha'u'llah, together with some of the members of his family and escorted by an officer of the imperial bodyguard and an official representing the Russian legation, set out on 3 months' journey to Baghdad. Among those who shared his exile were his wife, the saintly Nawab, entitled by him the most exalted leaf, who during almost 40 years continued to evince a fortitude, a piety, a devotion, and a nobility of soul, which earned her from the pen of her Lord the posthumous and unrivaled tribute of having been made his perpetual consort in all the worlds of God. His 9-year-old son, later surnamed the Most Great Branch, destined to become the center of his covenant and authorized interpreter of his teachings, together with his 7-year-old sister, known in later years by the same title as that of her illustrious mother, and whose services until the ripe old age of 80 years and 6, no less than her exalted parentage, entitle her to the distinction of ranking as the outstanding heroine of the Baha'i dispensation, were also included among the exiles who were now bidding their last farewell to their native country. Of the 2 brothers who accompanied him on that journey, the first was Mirza Musa, commonly known as Agha Kalim, his staunch and valued supporter, the ablest and most distinguished among his brothers and sisters, and one of the only two persons who, according to Baha'u'llah's testimony, were adequately informed of the origins of his faith. The other was Mirza Muhammad Quli, a half-brother who, in spite of the defection of some of his relatives, remained to the end loyal to the cause he had espoused. The journey, undertaken in the depth of an exceptionally severe winter, carrying the little band of exiles so inadequately equipped across the snowbound mountains of Western Persia, though long and perilous, was uneventful except for the warm and enthusiastic reception accorded the travelers during their brief stay in Karan by its governor Hayat Quli Khan of the Aliya sect. He was shown in return such kindness by Baha'u'llah that the people of the entire village were affected and continued long after to extend such hospitality to his followers on their way to Baghdad that they gained the reputation of being known as Babis. In a prayer revealed by him at that time, Baha'u'llah, expatiating upon the woes and trials he had endured in the Siyachal, thus bears witness to the terrible hardships undergone in the course of that terrible journey. My God, my Master, my desire, Thou hast created this atom of dust through the consummate power of thy might, and nurtured him with thine hands, which none can chain up. Thou hast destined for him trials and tribulations which no tongue can describe, nor any of thy tablets adequately recount. The throat thou didst accustom to the touch of silk, thou hast, in the end, clasped with strong chains, and the body thou didst ease with brocades and velvets, thou hast at last subjected to the abasement of a dungeon. Thy decree hath shackled me with unnumbered fetters, and cast about my neck chains that none can sunder. A number of years have passed during which afflictions have, like showers of mercy, rained upon me. How many the nights during which the weight of chains and the fetters allowed me no rest, and how numerous the days during which peace and tranquility were denied me, by reason of that wherewith the hands and tongues of men have afflicted me. Both bread and water which thou hast through thy all-embracing mercy allowed unto the beasts of the field, they have for a time forbidden unto this servant, and the things they refuse to inflict upon such as have seceded from thy cause, the same have they suffered to be inflicted upon me, until finally thy decree was irrevocably fixed, and thy behest summoned this servant to depart out of Persia, accompanied by a number of frail-bodied men and children of tender age, at this time when the cold is so intense that one cannot even speak, and ice and snow so abundant that it is impossible to move.
We are now going to deal with this journey of Baha'u'llah from Tehran, heading to Baghdad. He was praising Prince Dolgoruki. Like I said, he wrote a tablet to Nikolaevich Alexander II, the Russian Tsar, saying that God has given you an exalted station. Beware lest you barter it away. As he's writing to him to let him know the magnificence of who he is. He also talks in that tablet about the amazing services that were rendered by Dolgoruki, how he really tried, and he was constantly stopped by a lot of the clergy, a lot of the ulama around him to try and deliver Baha'u'llah into safety. The Shah's edict that said that Baha'u'llah must leave, this marks what's known as one of the most glorious chapters from this point. For almost 40 years, Baha'u'llah was going to be in exile. It talks about the cleansing power that he has, the healing influence, the world-shaping force that's going to come out of this. He went from Baghdad afterwards, and he heads up to Istanbul, and then from Istanbul to Edirne, and then he ends up, of course, back in the Holy Land. There are some prophecies that talk about him being an Akka, and they come a little bit later in God Passes By. So we're going to look at what some of those things are. We don't need to deal with them right now. There were these 4 stages, the first stage being the first 27 years of Baha'u'llah, where he was relatively free. He was enjoying the wealth of his father and the position that he had, because obviously his father was in the position in the court of the Shah, but he was also helping the disconsolate, and he was dedicating a lot of his time to serving people. He wasn't just relaxing and chilling, but that period was relatively safe. Then we have the second period, which lasts 9 years, and he's eventually then put into the Siyachal, and there's the 4 months in prison. And then we have the eruption of the forces in the final stage, where this is where Baha'u'llah, everything starts coming out of him. The glory, the power really starts flying out. There's reference made to the story of Abraham, And we know Abraham's the one who had to sacrifice his son, who some believe to be Ishmael, some believe to be others. It depends on who you're asking. And he's put into exile, and he has to go from Ur to the Chaldees. And this move that he had to go to, this seeming hardship, is what allowed actually his faith to spread and everything. And I think the guidance is drawing a similarity to the sufferings that Baha'u'llah had, where he had to go from Baghdad to Istanbul to Edirne and then coming down to the Holy Land. So he's drawing parallels with things that have happened in the past. The 12th of January, 1853. After coming back from Kabul, 9 months in Kabul, that's when he was going to leave for Baghdad. Now, that journey was taken with some of his family. It took 3 months. Now, we can't see them here on our map, unfortunately, but there's mountains here. And they cut pretty much right across here and they separate. And this is why you'll notice in Baghdad you have dates, you have palm trees. It's kind of summer all year round. It's pretty much on the same latitude as Isfahan, for example, but they will have bitterly cold winters. And it's because of these mountains that lie in between. So Baha'u'llah and his family had to go over these mountains. Abdul Baha was part of that journey. We know that Baha'i Khanum was also part of that journey. Abdul Baha, in fact, ends up with chilblains as a result of the cold, the bitter cold of that journey. Mirza Musa, who was the brother of Baha'u'llah. The other person that they talk about is the half-brother of Baha'u'llah, Mirza Muhammad Quli. His whole family, they kind of rejected the faith and went away, but he stayed very steadfast. Mirza Mehdi, the brother of Abdul Baha, who falls through the skylight, he actually didn't join them on that journey. He came later. Eventually, as they're on their way to Baghdad, they end up in a place called Karand. They are absolutely besotted by Baha'u'llah, and they're just known to be Babis, and they're like, wow, this is amazing. So again, they're traveling, they're prisoners that have been traveled. They were trying to get rid of the influence of the Babi faith. This was the whole reason. The power of the Babi faith. I think it was said at one point that they thought the whole of Iran was going to flip and we're going to become Babis. It was estimated that there was maybe 1 million Babis in Iran. So they very much wanted to get rid of Baha'u'llah from this area. Now, the Ottomans and the Persians didn't particularly get along, but they decided that this was better because if Baha'u'llah stayed with the influence in Iran, maybe this would allow the faith to grow. So the Ottomans, as a kind of favor, they said, fine, we will take Baha'u'llah and we will deal with him. Don't worry, we will keep him under wraps.
Finally, on the 28th of Jamadi Thani, 1269 AH, April 8th, 1853, Baha'u'llah arrived in Baghdad, the capital city of what was then the Turkish province of Iraq. From there, he proceeded, a few days after, to Kazimain, about 3 miles north of the city, a town inhabited chiefly by Persians, and where the 2 Kazims, the 7th and 9th Imams, are buried. Soon after his arrival, the representative of the Shah's government, stationed in Baghdad, called on him and suggested it would be advisable for him, in view of the many visitors crowding that centre of pilgrimage, to establish his residence in Old Baghdad, a suggestion with which he readily concurred. A month later, towards the end of Rajab, he rented the house of Haji Ali Madad in an old quarter of the city, into which he moved with his family. In that city, described in Islamic traditions as Zahr al-Kufeh, designated for centuries as the abode of peace, and immortalized by Baha'u'llah as the city of God, he, except for his 2-year retirement to the mountains of Kurdistan and his occasional visits to Najaf, Karbala, and Kazimain, continued to reside until his banishment to Constantinople. To that city, the Quran had alluded as the abode of peace, to which God himself calleth. To it, in that same book, further allusion had been made in the verse, for them is a dwelling of peace with their Lord, on the day whereon God shall gather them all together. From it radiated, wave after wave, a power, a radiance, and a glory which insensibly reanimated a languishing faith, sorely stricken, sinking into obscurity, threatened with oblivion. From it were diffused, day and night, and with ever-increasing energy, the first emanations of a revelation which in its scope, its copiousness, its driving force, and the volume and variety of its literature was destined to excel that of the Bab himself. Above its horizon burst forth the rays of the Sun of Truth, whose rising glory had for 10 long years been overshadowed by the inky clouds of a consuming hatred, an ineradicable jealousy, an unrelenting malice. In it, the tabernacle of the promised Lord of Hosts was first erected, and the foundations of the long-awaited kingdom of the Father unassailably established. Out of it went forth the earliest tidings of the message of salvation, which, as prophesied by Daniel, was to mark, after the lapse of 1,290 days, 1290 AH, the end of the abomination that maketh desolate. Within its walls, the most great house of God, his footstool and the throne of his glory, the cynosure of an adoring world, the lamp of salvation between earth and heaven, the sign of his remembrance to all who are in heaven and on earth, enshrining the jewel whose glory hath irradiated all creation, the standard of his kingdom, and the shrine round which will circle the concourse of the faithful, was irrevocably founded and permanently consecrated. Upon it, by the virtue of its sanctity as Baha'u'llah's most holy habitation and seat of his transcendent glory, was conferred the honour of being regarded as a centre of pilgrimage, second to none except the city of Akka, his most great prison, in whose immediate vicinity his holy sepulchre, the Qibla of the Baha'i world, is enshrined. Around the heavenly table, spread in its very heart, clergy and laity, Sunnis and Shias, Kurds, Arabs and Persians, princes and nobles, peasants and dervishes, gathered in increasing numbers from far and near, all partaking, according to their needs and capacities, of a measure of that divine sustenance which was to enable them, in the course of time, to noise abroad the fame of that bountiful giver, swell the ranks of his admirers, scatter far and wide his writings, enlarge the limits of his congregation, and lay a firm foundation for the future erection of the institutions of his faith. And finally, before the gaze of the diversified communities that dwelt within its gates, the first phase in the gradual unfoldment of a newborn revelation was ushered in. The first effusions from the inspired pen of its author were recorded. The first principles of his slowly crystallizing doctrine were formulated. The first implications of his august station were apprehended. The first attacks aiming at the disruption of his faith from within were launched. The first victories over its eternal enemies were registered, and the first pilgrimages to the door of his presence were undertaken. This lifelong exile, to which the bearer of so precious a message was now providentially condemned, did not, and indeed could not, manifest either suddenly or rapidly the potentialities latent within it. The process whereby its unsuspected benefits were to be manifested to the eyes of men was slow, painfully slow, and was characterized, as indeed the history of his faith from its inception to the present day demonstrates, by a number of crises which at times threatened to arrest its unfoldment and blast all the hopes which its progress had engendered.
Baha'u'llah, on the 8th of April, 1853, lands in none other than Baghdad. Whilst he's there, he tarries for a few days. He then goes to Qazimain. Qazimain, which is very close to Baghdad, has the shrines of the 7th Imam and the 9th Imam. So he goes there. There are many people that are crowding around there, and then they say to Baha'u'llah, maybe you shouldn't stay here, maybe go to the old city and live in there, the old city in Baghdad. So Baha'u'llah ends up renting a house of Haji Ali Madad. He refers to this place as the abode of peace, which I believe is also in the Quran is given the same name. The city of God also it's called. So it's a really special place. Baha'u'llah was very much in love with Baghdad and the happenings that took place there. The Quran prophesies that the dwelling place of the Lord will be in the abode of peace. Daniel, he prophesies this 2,300 days that are going to take place since the rebuilding of the temple, which I believe it was in the year 457 BC. This rebuilding of the temple of Jerusalem that takes place. So in the book of Daniel, it's prophesied that these 2,300 days will elapse. It's in Ezekiel that it said that each day is equal to a year. So this takes us all the way through to this prophecy that takes place in 1844, from the point that the temple was rebuilt to when him and God shall make manifest will essentially appear. Baghdad is also then to be the center of pilgrimage, second only to Akka. Many people were coming to Baghdad to see him. There were many diverse communities, Sunnis, Shias, Christians, Jews, a complete mixture of people, and people are starting to imbibe what Baha'u'llah is spreading and sharing. This is the first place where Baha'u'llah reveals who he is. The first pilgrimages happened here, that the first atrocities in Baghdad start happening against him, and these crises and victories that go on. So we'll carry on unless there's any comments or questions, if anyone wants to add anything to this particular section.
One point of interest is the prophecy in the Quran. Of course, that was before Baghdad itself was founded. Baghdad was founded, I think, in 762, so it's quite some time after the Quran was written.
Could you elaborate? I think it was on page 368, where it says, "In it, the tabernacle of the promised Lord of hosts," or something, was first erected.
So that I think is the Temple of Jerusalem. I think it's making reference to. Is that right, Nabil?
Yeah. I mean, Baha'u'llah is the Lord of hosts.
Thank you.
One such crisis which, as it deepened, threatened to jeopardize his newborn faith and to subvert its earliest foundations, overshadowed the first years of his sojourn in Iraq, the initial stage in his lifelong exile, and imparted to them a special significance. Unlike those which preceded it, this crisis was purely internal in character, and was occasioned solely by the acts, the ambitions and follies of those who were numbered among his recognized fellow disciples. The external enemies of the faith, whether civil or ecclesiastical, who had thus far been chiefly responsible for the reverses and humiliations it had suffered, were by now relatively quiescent. The public appetite for revenge, which had seemed insatiable, had now to some extent, in consequence of the torrents of blood that had flowed, abated. A feeling bordering on exhaustion and despair had, moreover, settled on some of its most inveterate enemies, who were astute enough to perceive that though the faith had been bent beneath the grievous blows their hands had dealt it, its structure had remained essentially unimpaired and its spirit unbroken. The orders issued to the governors of the provinces by the Grand Vizier had had, furthermore, a sobering effect on the local authorities, who were now dissuaded from venting their fury upon, and from indulging in their sadistic cruelties against, a hated adversary. A lull had, in consequence, momentarily ensued, which was destined to be broken at a later stage by a further wave of repressive measures in which the Sultan of Turkey and his ministers, as well as the Sunni sacerdotal order, were to join hands with the Shah and the Shia clericals of Persia and Iraq in an endeavour to stamp out once and for all the faith and all it stood for. While this lull persisted, the initial manifestations of the internal crisis already mentioned were beginning to reveal themselves, a crisis which, though less spectacular in the public eye, proved itself, as it moved to its climax, to be one of unprecedented gravity, reducing the numerical strength of the infant community, imperiling its unity, causing immense damage to its prestige, and tarnishing for a considerable period of time its glory. This crisis had already been brewing in the days immediately following the execution of the Bab, was intensified during the months when the controlling hand of Baha'u'llah was suddenly withdrawn as a result of his confinement in the Siyat Shah of Tehran, was further aggravated by his precipitate banishment from Persia, and began to protrude its disturbing features during the first years of his sojourn in Baghdad. Its devastating force gathered momentum during his 2-year retirement in the mountains of Kurdistan, and though it was checked for a time after his return from Sulaymaniyah under the overmastering influences exerted preparatory to the declaration of his mission, it broke out later with still greater violence and reached its climax in Adrianople, only to receive finally its death blow under the impact of the irresistible forces released through the proclamation of that mission to all mankind. Its central figure was no less a person than the nominee of the Bab himself, the credulous and cowardly Mirza Yahya, to certain traits of whose character reference has already been made in the foregoing pages. The black-hearted scoundrel who befooled and manipulated this vain and flaccid man with consummate skill and unyielding persistence was a certain Sayyid Muhammad, a native of Esfahan, notorious for his inordinate ambition, his blind obstinacy and uncontrollable jealousy. To him, Baha'u'llah had later referred in the Kitab al-Aqdas as the one who had led astray Mirza Yahya, and stigmatized him in one of his tablets as the source of envy and the quintessence of mischief, while Abdul Baha had described the relationship existing between these two as that of the sucking child to the much prized breast of its mother. Forced to abandon his studies in the Madrasa Sadra of Esfahan, this Sayyid had migrated in shame and remorse to Karbala, had there joined the ranks of the Bab's followers, and shown after his martyrdom signs of vacillation which exposed the shallowness of his faith and the fundamental weakness of his convictions. Baha'u'llah's first visit to Karbala and the marks of undisguised reverence, love and admiration shown him by some of the most distinguished among the former disciples and companions of Sayyid Kazim had aroused in this calculating and unscrupulous schemer an envy, and bred in his soul an animosity, which the forbearance and patience shown him by Baha'u'llah had served only to inflame. His deluded helpers, willing tools of his diabolical designs, were not inconsiderable in number of Babis, who, baffled, disillusioned, and leaderless, were already predisposed to be beguiled by him into pursuing a path diametrically opposed to the tenets and counsels of a departed leader. For with the Bab no longer in the midst of his followers, with his nominee either seeking a safe hiding place in the mountains of Mazindaran, or wearing the disguise of a dervish, or of an Arab wandering from town to town, with Baha'u'llah imprisoned and subsequently banished beyond the limits of his native country, with the flower of the faith mown down in a seemingly unending series of slaughters, the remnants of that persecuted community were sunk in a distress that appalled and paralyzed them, that stifled their spirit, confused their minds, and strained to the utmost their loyalty. Reduced to this extremity, they could no longer rely on any voice that commanded sufficient authority to still their forebodings, resolve their problems, or prescribe to them their duties and obligations.
A lot of the persecutions that were taking place from the central government and the ulamas, they seem to simmer down a bit. They think, right, we've got Baha'u'llah out the way, the Bab has passed away, Qutb has gone, Mullah Hussein, Tahrir, Wahid, Hujjat, all of these people, it seems to be simmering down. However, we have this first crisis, which is actually an internal crisis, which was precipitated by Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan. Mirza Yahya was, of course, Baha'u'llah's half-brother. He was the nominated leader of the Babis, according to His Holiness the Bab, who was meant to have some power until whom God shall make manifest will come in, and there was a bunch of things that basically rendered that useless. Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan decides that he's going to really try and push Mirza Yahya and say, come on, like, you can do it. And it's the thing in his ear that's really pushing him forward. The trouble started when Baha'u'llah was in prison. And when Baha'u'llah was away for 2 years in Sulaymaniyeh, this is when Mirza Yahya starts trying to gain some of his powers, but Sayyid Muhammad of Isfahan is trying to lead astray the Babi community. Baha'u'llah says that he's the quintessence of mischief in the Kitab al-Aqdas. He started ramping things up massively and trying to cause all these problems. Mirza Yahya ends up becoming a dervish with Baha'u'llah being imprisoned. Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani is really causing some issues.
Is there anything written about why the Bab, who surely would have known how Mirza Yahya would behave, why he would nominate him as the central figure?
I think part of the reason was to not have any emphasis on Baha'u'llah. Because if you imagine if Baha'u'llah was the nominated leader, what would happen if he was the man in charge? So I think part of it to take some of the heat off Baha'u'llah, really, so that Baha'u'llah can continue on his mission. Baha'u'llah was constantly trying to look after Mirza Yahya and trying to counsel him. He had a mind of his own, and he ended up turning rogue, unfortunately.
Nabil, travelling at that time through the province of Khorasan, the scene of the tumultuous early victories of a rising faith, had himself summed up his impressions of the prevailing condition. The fire of the cause of God, he testifies in his narrative, had been well nigh quenched in every place. I could detect no trace of warmth anywhere. In Qazvin, according to the same testament, the remnant of the community had split into 4 factions, bitterly opposed to one another, and a prey to the most absurd doctrines and fancies. Baha'u'llah, upon his arrival in Baghdad, a city which had witnessed the glowing evidences of the indefatigable zeal of Tahirih, found among his countrymen residing in that city no more than a single Babi, while in Kazimane, inhabited chiefly by Persians, a mere handful of his compatriots remained who still professed, in fear and obscurity, their faith in the Bab. The morals of the members of this dwindling community, no less than their numbers, had sharply declined. Such was their waywardness and folly, to quote Baha'u'llah's own words, that upon his release from prison, his first decision was to arise and undertake with the utmost vigour the task of regenerating this people. As the character of the professed adherents of the Bab declined, and as proofs of the deepening confusion that afflicted them multiplied, the mischief makers, who were lying in wait, and whose sole aim was to exploit the progressive deterioration in the situation for their own benefit, grew ever more and more audacious. The conduct of Mirza Yahya, who claimed to be the successor of the Bab, and who prided himself on his high-sounding titles of Miratul Azaliyah, everlasting mirror, or Subh Azal, morning of eternity, and of Ismul Azal, name of eternity, and particularly the machinations of Sayyid Muhammad, exalted by him to the rank of the first among the witnesses of the Bayan, were by now assuming such a character that the prestige of the faith was becoming directly involved, and its future security seriously imperiled. The former had, after the execution of the Bab, sustained such a violent shock that his faith almost forsook him. Wandering for a time in the guise of a dervish in the mountains of Mazindaran, he, by his behaviour, had so severely tested the loyalty of his fellow believers in Nur, most of whom had been converted through the indefatigable zeal of Baha'u'llah, that they too wavered in their convictions, some of them going so far as to throw in their lot with the enemy. He subsequently proceeded to Rasht and remained concealed in the province of Gilan until his departure for Kermanshah, where, in order the better to screen himself, he entered the service of a certain Abdullah-i Kazvini, a maker of shrouds, and became a vendor of his goods. He was still there when Baha'u'llah passed through that city on his way to Baghdad.
And expressing a desire to live in close proximity to Baha'u'llah, but in a house by himself where he could ply some trade incognito.
He succeeded in obtaining from him a sum of money with which he purchased several bales of cotton and then proceeded in the garb of an Arab by way of Mandalij to Baghdad. He established himself there in the street of the charcoal dealers, situated in a dilapidated quarter of the city, and placing a turban upon his head and assuming the name of Haji Ali Lasfush, embarked on his newly chosen occupation. Sayyid Muhammad had meanwhile settled in Kabbalah and was busily engaged with Mirza Yahya as his leaver in kindling dissensions and in deranging the life of the exiles and of the community that had gathered about them. Little wonder that from the pen of Baha'u'llah, who was as yet unable to divulge the secret that stirred within his bosom, these words of warning, of counsel, and of assurance should, at a time when the shadows were beginning to deepen around him, have proceeded. The days of tests are now come. Oceans of dissension and tribulation are surging, and the banners of doubt are, in every nook and corner, occupied in stirring up mischief and in leading men to perdition. Suffer not the voice of some of the soldiers of negation to cast doubt into your midst, neither allow yourselves to become heedless of him who is the truth, inasmuch as in every dispensation such contentions have been raised. God, however, will establish his faith and manifest his light, albeit the stirrers of sedition abhor it. Watch ye every day for the cause of God. All are held captive in his grasp. No place is there for anyone to flee to. Think not the cause of God to be a thing lightly taken, in which anyone can gratify his whims. In various quarters a number of souls have, at the present time, advanced this same claim. The time is approaching when every one of them will have perished and been lost. They will have come to naught and become a thing unremembered, even as the dust itself.
Mirza Yahya is really causing as many problems as he can. Nabil says that while he was in Khorasan, the passion seemed to have been quenched. Anywhere he went, the fire was quenched, he says. Baha'u'llah in Baghdad, when he was there, he only found one believer. And this is incredible that Tahirih, who was there, who was so powerful and mighty in espousing the cause of the Bab, the numbers had completely dwindled. The community was going down. Baha'u'llah, after coming out of prison, he had decided that he was going to arise and he was going to regenerate the community. We hear about Mirza Yahya having these magnificent titles that he'd put upon himself and how he was the everlasting mirror. And Sayyid Muhammad says that, yes, you're a witness. Remember, the Babis had these ranks of mirrors and witnesses that never really took off. You had the letters of the living, and after the letters of the living, each of the letters of the living, it was said they would have a mirror, and each of those mirrors would have a witness. And this is the way things were explained. So he's trying to give Yahya as much power. And we know that Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani end up hanging out in Karbala together. And in Karbala, they're causing many, many problems. Baha'u'llah, obviously, this is his half-brother, Mirza Yahya, writes to him, and he tries counseling him many times, and he tries to say to him, stop doing what you're doing and recognize the truth. But he hadn't revealed who he was yet at this point.
You'll remember that when Tahirih left Iraq and went back to Qazvin, there were, 1,000 of her followers were with her, right?
Well, 1,200.
1,200 people, and now none were left. One was left. And in her town of Qazvin, they had divided into 4 factions. Quite impressive how, well, I think it's probably just the fact that if you want to raise your hand and say, I'm a Babi, you'll get your head chopped off. So maybe that was what was going on in the minds of all these devoted followers of hers.
Well, exactly. I mean, you look at her around and you see what's happened. These people who claim to be Babis, the Bab himself has now been martyred. He's gone. The most powerful, when you see people like Tahirah being martyred, Qaddus, Bahir, Hujjat, Mullah Hussein, I think it's very testing at the time. You're like, look, all that's going to happen is people are getting killed. There is no hope. This is going nowhere, essentially. So yeah, I think very, very testing time for the Babis. And this is where Baha'u'llah comes in, and he really sort of releases these powers, and he says he arises and then he's going to regenerate. That's the mission which he's charged with. So it seems like the Babi faith is being wrapped up, but then Baha'u'llah comes in.
Can I also add to that? Like, I just think that, you know, he's Baha'u'llah and the Bab, and coming in and talking about peace and how they're going to unify the world, how they're going to, you know, make us into better people. And I can just imagine, as a human being, you'll be so attracted to all of that, thinking, yeah, I want to join that faith, as I have myself. And then, you know, all of a sudden you're being persecuted and there's a lot of jealousy and there's all these attacks. It's a bit of a juxtaposition though, isn't it? And I feel like it's kind of quite similar to these times. I feel like the tests are continuously happening now, where you come into a faith believing that you want to bring about unity and you're so in love with it, yet you're continuously tested by people's jealousies and people's, you know, what have you. Anyway, I just wanted to add to that.
Thank you, Sandra. No, you're 100% right. I think to have faith, I think you're going to be tested. You can't become a competent captain on calm seas. It's only by being in these rough seas sometimes that you become a competent captain. And I think these tests that we have and everything in society today seems to be lead against us to stop being Babis, to stop being Baha'is. And it was so much more stark and black and white then that you would have your head chopped off, your children may be killed in front of you. You'd have candles put inside you, you know, molten lead. So when you're seeing families being torn apart and everything being lost, staying a Babi takes some real special power and depth. And this is where, I guess, studying in and deepening and really honing in and grabbing this spirit that's out there and letting that animate your soul, incredibly important.
I also want to go back to one of the passages that we read, Dave, where it said that Baha'u'llah said that these enemies of the faith would become a thing unremembered. The time is approaching when every one of them will have perished and been lost, nay, will have come to naught and become a thing unremembered, even as the dust itself. It happened that my mother was a pioneer in Cyprus, and she decided one day to find out what had happened to Mirza Yahya. And she had great difficulty in finding his burial place, a shambles. And then you observe the glory that is there in the Holy Land, where the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and now Abdul Baha have such magnificent shrines. And the contrast is just overpowering, even as the dust, a thing unremembered.
Absolutely. You look at Haji Mirza Raghasi, how powerful he was. He ended up dwindling and going to completely nothing. Then you look at someone like the sifter of wheat, who was this guy who would literally just sift wheat. What happened to him? You know, he's remembered and will be remembered eternally. So this is the time when there's regeneration, where things will be flipped on their head. This mystery of reversal that's spoken about in the Surah Balash, for how things are going to change, how the meek shall inherit the earth. It's an amazing time where things are changing. So thank you for that, Rick. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for joining. Right now, we're going to move on to the devotional portion of this study class. We will be joining you again in 2 days for God Passes By. And of course, the dawn break is tomorrow. So 7 days a week, 6 p.m, we are always here London time. So I invite everyone or whoever so wishes to come in and share some prayers. And again, if we could also remember perhaps my dear father who 12 years ago ascended to the Abha kingdom and is looking down on me and is very proud of my brother. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please, if you'd like to offer a prayer, now would be wonderful to do so. Thank you.
هوالله ای عاشق روی بها، توجه به ملکوت غیب جبروت کن و بگو: ای هادی ابرار، ای واقف اسرار، ای مونس اخیار، جانم به فدایت. ای دلبر دلجوی، ای سرور خوشخوی، ای گل رخ مهروی، جانم به فدایت. حاجت تو بدانی، هرچند نهانی، در هر دم و آنی، جانم به فدایت. عین عین